I'd like you to welcome to the next installation of the ACDH-CH lectures series, especially the many people online, as I heard, thousands listening to us. I have the honor to welcome to this lecture our dear colleague Toma Tasovac, who is the director of the European Research Infrastructure, Digital Research Infrastructure of the Arts and Humanities, DARIAH. He's with an academic background in comparative literature and degrees in Harvard, Princeton, and Trinity College Dublin. Toma's areas of scholarly expertise include historical lexicography and development of language resources, data modeling, digital editions, and research infrastructures, unsurprisingly. Next to many manifold activities of his, he is also the co-creator of TILX0, a baseline encoding for format for lexicographic data, which has received the 2020 RADS Prize for TI Ingenuity from the TI Consortium. And he's the co-editor, together with another DARIAH director, Sally Chambers, of the forthcoming book, Digital Humanities and Introduction for Librarians. The title of today's talk is Digital Humanities and Unsurprising Tenacity of the Print Mind, in which Toma reflects on the bread and butter of the most of our professional work, the text, and its seeming disappointing unwillingness to jump to the next level of evolution marked by the electronic textuality. At least that's what I understood from the teaser. Toma promised or threatened when we discussed this talk before, it will be some serious abstract thinking, so I'm curious to that. And we're looking forward to that. So, Toma, thank you again for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mate. This is not my first rodeo, as they say in the States. Metaphorically speaking, if this was a rodeo, it would definitely be my first. But what I'm trying to say is it's always a pleasure to come back to Vienna to meet with Austrian colleagues and friends. And as the director of DARIAH, I am very proud to say that Austria is one of our strongest nodes in the European infrastructure landscape, and I always learn a lot when I come here. So thank you for having me. I wish you a lot of patience for the next 45 minutes or so. Trust me, you'll need it, but yes. Thank you. But we'll get there. So, titles. Titles of academic talks are notoriously unreliable. The reason why is relatively simple. Usually the titles are settled long before the lecture is actually prepared. And titles, these kinds of titles come with particular, stylistic best practices of their own. You have to be vague in your title so that you can give yourself some wiggle room to kind of actually write the lecture. And then you also want to sound a little bit pretentious and bombastic so that people can kind of say, oh, maybe this is wrong, but it might be interesting. So this is how titles usually work in the academic context. But in this particular case, the title, Digital Humanities and the Unsurprising Tenacity of the Print Mind, is actually real. It's not fake news at all. It reflects a long-time preoccupation of mine with textuality. Especially with remediation of text, right? The turn from analog to digital, both on a higher conceptual level. What is the nature of textual objects in digital editions, in digital collections, in digital libraries, and also on a very practical level. What are the formats and mechanisms for delivering texts in the digital realm? But one question remains about this title. So what is the print mind and what is it doing in my title? Well, the print mind usually refers to a set of intellectual attitudes that are developed through the experience of reading print materials, such as books and newspapers. And some characteristics of the print mind include linear thinking. The print mind tends to process information in a linear sequential manner. Attention to detail. Reading print materials requires sustained attention and focus, which can lead to an increased attention to detail. The print mind is better equipped for retaining information over a long period of time. So that's why people say it actually improves long-time memory. And analytical thinking, of course. So this is not radical thinking, what I'm saying so far. It's a fairly established line of thought. Marshall McLuhan, in his 1964 book, Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, argued that the shift from oral to written forms of communication with the advent of printing had a profound impact on human thought and culture. One of my favorite books of all time, Elizabeth Einstein's The Printing Revolution in Early Modern Europe. In it, she wrote about how the typographic fixity of the printing presses in the 16th century fully transformed the European, or the world intellectual landscape, our methods of data collection and retrieval and storage, and our patterns of communication. And then Walter Ong, an American cultural historian and communication theorist, in his book Orality and Literacy, The Technologizing of the Word, argues that the move from oral to written forms of communication brought about changes in cognitive processes and ways of thinking. And finally, on a kind of more mainstream, less academic side of things, we have Nicholas Carr, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, which has really pushed the message that something's not right about the way we process information today, and how it's, the internet and the information overload is leading to distraction and kind of long-term cognitive impairment. The question is, of course, how, there are balances to all of these arguments, and ultimately some things depend on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, because you can't really define the internet in just one sentence as a positive or a negative phenomenon. But this is not, the cognitive aspect, this is not what I want to talk about. I will not focus on digital distraction or cognitive aspects of information overload. I want to talk about the print mind in a very limited sense, from a specifically DH angle, as a set of socio-technical principles that affect the way we engage with texts in the digital realm, the way we conceptualize digital editions, the way we build interfaces, the way we create corpora, and the way we maintain metadata. And the reason why I obsess about some of these things, perhaps a little more than others, has very much to do with the kind of work I do today. So this is what Mate mentioned: text encoding, data modeling, TI, infrastructure building, that sort of thing. But it also has to do with my formation, with my education, with how I came to do the things that I do today. And while I know that you didn't come here to hear my life story, that is not the goal of this lecture, I do have to start with a little bit of background. So I was trained as a literary scholar in the 20th century in the United States. I was trained as a literary scholar at the end of the 20th century at some, Mate mentioned them, prestigious hoity-toity American universities, at a time when the big theory wars in deconstruction as a school of thought or intellectual practice was still strong, but already showing signs of fatigue. And what did I learn as a literary scholar in the late 20th century? Well, I learned a lot about close reading. A cynic would say how to make a mountain out of a molehill, but I actually don't agree with that. I think close reading remains one of the true skills that we as humanities scholars have to have. And what is also interesting is that even before the advent of big data, those of us who worked in literary studies and especially those of us who had some training in, say, Russian formalism or things like that, we used to count things. We used to count vowels and consonants in poems and stressed and unstressed syllables. And so there is some statistics in small, close reading as well, which I think we need to keep in mind. Anyway, so I learned a lot about close reading. I learned almost nothing about the materiality of reading, about book history, and about print as medium. This was not part of our curricula. And I learned that text meaning is always already contentious, right? That there's always tension between content and context, or between what Umberto Eco called three different intentions: the intention of the author, the intention of the reader, and the intention of the work itself. He has a wonderful little book called Interpretation and Overinterpretation of Text that I heartily recommend. So, when I studied literature, textuality was analog and print-based by default. Of course it was, what else could it be? We didn't question the medium at all. And to be honest, we didn't know what we were missing. So one day, a friend of mine and I saw that a scholar from UCLA called Catherine Hales, who wrote the famous book, How We Became Post-Human, Virtual Bodies is Cybernetics, Literature and Informatics. She was going to spend a semester at Princeton, and she was going to teach a seminar on hypertext and electronic literature. And we were, you know, your typical depressed grad students who desperately were looking for something new and exciting in their lives. And we thought, well, this sounded very crazy, very non-Princeton-like at the time. There was, you know, nobody was talking about these things in the late 90s. And so we signed up for it. And thanks to this one seminar, which really changed the career path that I was on, I learned one more thing, which is that hypertext and electronic textuality, they were supposed to change everything. There was a huge amount of hype about how revolutionary these things were and how everything was going to change because of them. Now, what was so exciting about digital text at the turn of the century? Well, for one, a digital text is, quote unquote, non-identical to itself, right? What's on the surface, on the screen, is not necessarily what's behind how the text is encoded and delivered to the reader. So electronic texts are multi-layered and almost infinitely transformable objects. A digital text is also by definition fluid, volatile, and incomplete because it is always changeable. Updating a printed book is a complex, expensive, and fairly impractical enterprise. You basically need a new edition, you need a whole distribution network, you can't really get the updates into the hands of your users, etc., etc., etc. But updating electronic texts is cheap, easy, and instantaneous. So this seminar was super exciting and super frustrating at the same time. It was exciting because we explored for the first time the close relationship between textuality and technology. We focused on non-linearity, on narrative forking, on narrative multiplicity as the new default of telling stories, etc. However, it was also frustrating because from the very beginning I felt there was a little bit too much hype going on, and especially when we look at these early examples of what was called electronic literature at the time, literature written specifically for the internet, it wasn't all that great, to be honest. And it didn't really quite live up to its expectation. It was fun to look at it, it was fun to discuss it, but that really didn't make a lasting impression. So, if we fast forward 20 years later, we can see that hypertext literature didn't really transform literary production for good. People still write for the print medium, people still read books, and to be honest, you don't need hypertext to have a non-linear narrative. Non-linear narrative have existed in literature much longer and much before we had the internet. But electronic textuality did transform the human intellectual landscape, for sure. Modes of reading, as I said, methods of data collection, retrieval, and storage, and our patterns of communication, and so maybe even cognition. So all in all, we were about 50% right at the time. So when I try to translate what I learned back then about the nature of textuality as a budding grad student into what I see around me today, I can report also some noticeable successes as well as some possible failures. On the one hand, yes, DH texts are multi-layered objects. You know, think about TEI, think about digital libraries, think about the difference between text encoding as a kind of representation of what's in the text or of the text itself, and enrichment as you know, the act of interpretation or adding information to the text, providing context for the user, etc. And in theory, at least, our texts are infinitely annotatable, right? This is what we get from working in the digital medium. We could annotate ad infinitum. We could keep adding things to the text. But I would claim DH texts are not exactly radically fluid and volatile in the sense that we thought and hoped and maybe feared they would be. I don't think we've pushed them quite far enough. So my provocation for today, I have two versions. One is a polite one, which says that digital editions and digital collections and digital libraries do not yet take full advantage of electronic textuality. And slightly more bombastic way of putting it would be to say that digital editions, digital collections, and digital libraries should stop treating text as an atavistic relic of print culture. So, what's wrong with digital editions? Keep in mind, as I said in the beginning, I have to make some polemic statements to keep you awake. What's wrong with digital editions? Well, I would argue digital editions are to a large extent remediated print editions, and digital editions are almost exclusively made for human eyes. And I've lost my... Do I? Ah, okay. Very good. So, what do I mean by that? That digital editions to a large extent product of remediation. Basically, a venerated philological tradition has been transposed to a different medium. Yeah? We may use XML, we may automatically collate different versions of the text, we can search the text of our digital editions, but the product itself, the site of knowledge, as one scholar has called it, is more or less a static environment in which individuals can study the text. Digital editions use many conventions of their print counterparts, interfaces that simulate page layouts. The worst thing I find are these, there's a word for it, the interfaces where they digitally they recreate the process of turning pages, which I never understood why you needed that when you are not holding a book in your hand. But anyway, it's an aesthetic choice, so people have different preferences there. So we have interfaces that simulate page layouts and margins and the scholarly apparatus and footnotes. And they seem to be made really almost exclusively for human eyes, for human, consumption. I don't mean that, my dog wouldn't be interested in these, but we go to digital editions the same way that we would go to a book. Surely we can open it in the browser, on the phone, etc. But, we go to text, text don't come to us. I would claim that preparing text for human eyes only makes no sense digitally speaking. The question we should be asking is how could we create digital editions so that we can satisfy the human reader, which is of course the primary goal and the primary target, but also liberate the text and the knowledge contained in them. Let it flow out of the edition, so to speak. Now, having access to the source is one thing, and those of us who work in TI know the mantra: unless you share your TI sources with the world, you're not really truly sharing your text completely. Sharing the HTML version in a portal is not the same thing as having access to the source. But I think we could go one step further. I think we should stop thinking of texts as fixed objects and start thinking more of text as a kind of service. So not a static element, but actually an interactive method. And basically what we need are programmable digital editions. I borrow this term from Frank Fischer, who coined the term programmable corpora to refer to DRACOR, his corpus of dramatic texts, which is built around an API where the website and the graphical user interface is just one instantiation of the API. The text, the data itself, shouldn't be chained to a particular user interface. So we need to think of digital editions as containers or packages of multiple text services. I would love to see statistical methods applied not only to big data, but small data as well. I would love to see APIs and interfaces that let me concordance an individual text as a matter of fact, that let me inspect frequency lists as a matter of fact, that let me compare the semantic distribution in a given text against a representative corpus of the same period or the same author as a matter of fact. I would love to have an infrastructure which will let me easily create ad hoc corpora by assembling multiple texts from different sources on the fly. I would also love to have digital editions which come with a layer of NLP annotations for, at least lemmas and part of speech, as a matter of fact, as a given, as a condition of being a digital edition. And frankly speaking, it's a bit shocking that this is not already the case. Now, there's many reasons why, and one of them is that, the philological tradition and the linguistic tradition and the NLP tradition and the communities that are associated with them do not actually often work together. They develop their tools and products in kind of separate conceptual spaces, but very few digital editions. So digital editions are built on this philological tradition of kind of hand annotation, and this is brilliant. I'm not trying to change that. All I'm saying is that it's very strange that we are not applying NLP tools if for no other reasons, to make better searches. Full text search is fine, but if you're working on a morphologically complex language like Serbian, Russian, or any of the Slavic languages, without a lemma-based search, you're searching the results you get, the retrieval will be much less meaningful than if you had a proper NLP layer. So that should be, in my mind, really a non-brainer. Another thing I would love to see are anonymized metrics and traces of use in digital editions. Speaking of the materiality of the book, one of the, we can look at it now nostalgically, one of the things that I remember from getting books from the library in the very old days, before electronic catalogs, was this paper slip at the end, which would actually, it's a disaster from the privacy point of view, which would actually have a list of people who had consulted the book before. I'm not suggesting we need to, spy on our users now, but it would be, there's something very, very clean about our digital editions, but one of the things that we miss is this idea that you leave traces of use. You see how many people have read it, or which parts of this texts were read most often or quoted or cited, etc., etc. So some more interaction in this case would be really nice. But the problem with text that I'm trying to outline here goes beyond digital editions and beyond work done by DH scholars. So here's one example that some of you may know, because I like to use this example in talks. I like to use this example as a contender for the prize for the worst OCR in the history of the world. And just to clarify things, so this is a Serbian-German dictionary from the 18th century, and it was scanned by Google Books in the early days of digitization. So of course our tools have improved, but it does tell you something that, you know, Cyrillic was not very high on Google's list of priorities at the time, and certainly not the old Cyrillic. I'm not trying to diss OCR technology as such. We're making great progress at all. But another important point to make here is that, you know, 3D is very in right now. This is the topic, you know, we all want to digitize our cultural heritage in 3D, etc. I'm trying to say we haven't really fixed 2D yet. Please go ahead and do 3D, but there's so much more we still need to do about 2D. Anyway, the point is there's not a single, but literally not a single word that was recognized correctly here, okay? And even when you see something that looks correct, there's somewhere fällige in German, that should be heilige. So it's a false positive. So even something that appears right is actually wrong. The point here is not that Google did it badly at the time. The point is that this has been in Google Books for 10 years now, 15, I don't remember how many, and it will never get updated. It will never get fixed. And so if you are, you know, working on 18th century, if you're one of the many people in the world working on 18th century Serbian lexicography, you could imagine checking out this work from the library, working with your students, transcribing it, providing some annotations, etc. But where will that knowledge go? It will go in a separate digital edition somewhere else, and then the next person who comes to Google Books or your national library will still face the same old ugly OCR. That just doesn't make sense to me. Another example from corpus linguistics. So I was trying to look for an example this was for a workshop, to illustrate to students why linguistics has changed with the use of corpora and how dictionary making has changed. And a good example for that is, I mean, a classic example in the English language is the verb to cause. Okay, so because in the past when, you know, linguists were sitting in their armchairs and defining words from their head, the definition of cause was to make something happen. And that's what it means. But actually, it was only after people started looking at corpora is that they realized that what the verb actually means is to make something bad happens. Because you don't cause, at least in English, you usually don't cause happiness, you cause damage. You know, you don't cause joy, you cause destruction, etc. Okay, so I took this, you know, giant corpus of English based on online resources, and I was looking at the quick index, keyword in context, and I specifically asked for the word cause, but only as which has part of speech as a verb. And that's fine, and you have good examples in the inflected forms, not just the nominative, you know, not just the infinitive. So we have causes physical damage, causing some amount of public controversy, caused fire and smoke damage, causes dry mouth, etc. And then in the second row from below, no, not second, fourth, cause we are America, okay? Which is because we are America, which is here mistakenly taken to be a verb. Fine. For a humanist scholar, it may be a little disheartening to go to a class and learn about corpus linguistic, and the first thing they will do is to you as an instructor say, oh, but look at this mistake. And there is some expectation management that needs to be done when you're introducing tools and corpus-based tools to a humanities audience. This is not, this is annotation done by machines. This is not your boutique digital edition, etc. So we need to treat these things as different and have certain expectations of them. There is even something, I would say, liberating in being able to say that, perfection is the enemy of the good, etc., etc., etc. But the point I'm trying to make is that why do we never fix these mistakes in corpora? Why are corpora all done, annotated automatically with a certain amount of error and left to live in this kind of, what I would call impermanent disgrace? No, it's a joke. I'm a big fan of corpora. They're left to live with their errors. Yeah, they are frozen texts. Textual objects aimed at human consumption are largely print-like in their stability and finality. This is the point I'm trying to make. Google Books or any large digital library will continue to serve bad OCR, even the same object is fixed by scholars elsewhere. And the same principle applies to linguistic corpora. There is no, often there is no feedback mechanism. Now, why is it so difficult to keep updating scholarly text objects? Well, there are numerous reasons, but I would claim that technology is not the issue here. The print mind is. And what do I mean by that? Well, the print mind craves textual stability. Textual stability is the cornerstone of bibliographic work. Libraries need stable objects so that they can catalog them and describe them properly, assign them stable metadata, but keep in mind that metadata itself is another kind of textual object, right? So it's text about text. And textual stability is also the cornerstone of scientific work. So we need stable objects so that we can refer to them, cite them, use them as evidence. We need stable objects so that others can find and verify our work. We need stable objects because the opposite of stability is instability, and instability leads to chaos. Establishing continuous feedback mechanisms from scholars working on textual objects to the providers of those textual objects would require that we stop thinking of both the textual objects and their metadata as stable, permanent, and non-changeable entities. Would that necessarily lead to chaos? I don't think so. If you've done some software development work, you have probably come across Git and Subversion and other similar versioning systems. What's a versioning system? Well, it's a powerful mechanism for keeping track of changes. Software is written as text. It may get compiled into binaries and this and that, but it's really just text. And it changes all the time. Yet software developers have come up with nifty mechanisms for keeping track of all these changes. Each version is committed to the repository, uniquely identified, so you can go back in time, you can reverse the changes, you can merge the changes, you can cite particular moments in the development of the software, etc., etc., etc. And similarly, when you deposit a paper, a preprint, into an institutional repository like HAL or Zenodo, it is by default saved as version 1. I mean, it may work in different repositories in different ways, but you can always upload the next version. It receives its own version number. And I think this is what we need. I think the solution is simple. We need versionable digital editions. We need versionable corpora. We need versionable assets in digital libraries. And we need versionable metadata. So, why are we not merging textual enrichment back into digital collections or digital libraries? Why are we serving corpora that have been annotated once by machines with a certain percentage of error, which could be, over time, corrected by users, by scholars, by the crowd? Why are we okay with annotation being something you do before you publish a text, a corpus or a digital edition, but never after? Part of the problem is that there are institutional obstacles to smoother workflows between research and cultural heritage institutions, for instance. We work under different ministries, we have different sources of funding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's a question of resources, for sure. Often these things get developed in projects, and they can be sustained and hosted for 5 years after the end of the project, and then archived somewhere to die a quiet death in absolute neglect, unless we have proper infrastructures that can actually help sustain these things. But this idea that a text is final, finished, done with, truly makes no sense in the digital realm, which is why I think we need to switch gears and remind ourselves what electronic textuality has promised to us, and that is the possibility of infinite progression. Should we think of the library as a temple erected to preserve certain rituals of consuming knowledge, which includes notions of the asset modeled after a book, which is catalogued once and left to languish in peace? Or should we think of the library as a dynamic node in our infrastructural landscape, a laboratory in which researchers and citizen scientists and the general public consume but also produce knowledge, create, generate new knowledge? If we take electronic textuality and its potential seriously, then we should start to loosen up the notion of stable, unchangeable metadata. And again, I'm not that crazy. I'm not proposing total anarchy and chaos. I am proposing versionable metadata. Each metadata record in a catalog should be assigned a version. Many, if most, metadata objects in a library will never change, but some will. Users could propose changes, enrichments, additions. These could be verified, validated, and eventually adopted in batches, prompting some kind of automized creation of a new version of the metadata object. So when you are citing a particular work that you have borrowed from a library, borrowed quote unquote, if it's an electronic resource, you would be actually citing a particular version of the metadata object, and therefore there would be no confusion as to what you are referring to and in what particular period of time you use this resource, etc. So if metadata objects were versionable, it would be rather trivial actually to refer to a particular version or to calculate and track changes across time. Even maybe study the enrichment practices, establish certain patterns of how these records changed in the library, etc. And while technical challenges could probably be solved, the more difficult question would always be raised about quality control and power dynamics, right? What becomes of the library catalog when its source of authority is no longer guaranteed by its permanence? Who controls the catalog, the librarian or the users, etc.? Now, early pronouncements and predictions on technology are often wrong, right? Many early commentators predicted that radio would be a passing fad and that people would quickly tire of listening to music and news on the airwaves. And before television was widespread, many experts claimed that it would have very little impact on society and would never replace radio as the dominant form of media. And then in the 90s, some experts claimed that the internet would be nothing more than a niche market for academics and researchers, and that it would never catch on with the general public. And also, before the widespread adoption of mobile phones, many experts claimed that devices were too expensive and too limited in functionality to ever become popular. So early predictions don't have to come true. But when we speak, what I'm trying to do here is not make predictions. I try to speak of potentials. And when we speak about the potential of electronic textuality, we're not predicting that things will turn out a certain way, but discussing possible alternative futures that we could inhabit. And in terms of this potential, in terms of the sheer possibility of what digital text could become, I think there's still not just hope, but room for growth. Textual fluidity, the way I've talked about it today, is a challenge for sources of scholarly and institutional authority, but versioning, I believe, is a mechanism for preventing chaos. So, where would I like to see text go? Well, first of all, text as a service, programmable digital editions. I would love to see continuous feedback loops between users and content providers. This is also why it's so important for institutions like ACDH to also work with cultural heritage institutions, or for DARIAH as an infrastructure, etc. I would love to see versionable text, corpora and metadata, and of course I would love to see us all build better infrastructures. One can always dream. If there is one final takeaway message from my ramblings today, it is that technology is not our ultimate challenge. Technology is easy. We have great developers. We can build pretty cool things. What is actually difficult is social change. Our cultural and ideological presuppositions determine to a great degree what we deem as possible or desirable. Our institutional setups and our reward mechanisms are inherently conservative. What our hiring or tenure committees at our universities, etc., what they count as valuable research outputs is but a fraction of what is involved actually in the process of generating and sustaining knowledge. So that's why we should all support initiatives such as QARA, the Coalition for the Advancement of Research Assessment Reform, and ultimately that's also why we should be continuing to meet and discuss how we can build better research infrastructures. We certainly still have a long way to go. Thank you very much for bearing with me.